Before anyone inside St. Aldrich's Cathedral noticed the bride was missing, before the string quartet stopped playing Pachelbel's canon, before 400 guests in the pews turned toward the empty doorway where white roses were still falling from a dropped bouquet, a woman in a torn wedding dress stumbled through the iron gates of the garden and said 3 words into the cold October air. "He bought me." Her voice was not loud. It was not a scream. It was the kind of whisper that travels farther than any shout because it carries the weight of something that should never have to be said. She stopped walking. Her chest heaved. Mascara ran down her face in dark rivers, and there was blood on her knuckles, fresh and red, from something she had done inside that cathedral that she would never regret. But then came the second sentence, and it was worse. My father signed the contract in front of me. 50 feet across the cobblestone courtyard, standing beside a black car that cost more than most people's homes, a man who had built an empire on silence and control slowly removed his hands from his pockets. His name was Lorcan Vane. He was not the kind of man who stopped for strangers. He was the kind of man strangers crossed the street to avoid. He controlled 3 territories, employed over 400 men, and had a reputation that made prosecutors retire early and witnesses forget what they had seen. But Lorcan Vane had not always been this. Once, he had been a boy who watched his mother walk out of a church in a dress she didn't choose, toward a man she didn't want, because someone had made a deal she wasn't allowed to refuse. The memory should have stayed buried. But something about the way this woman stood there, dress torn at the shoulder, blood drying on her hand, eyes holding a kind of fury that came only from betrayal by the people who were supposed to protect you. Something about that unlocked a door Lorcan had sealed shut 23 years ago. Even the man who ran this city could not look away from a bride who had just punched her way out of her own wedding. Lorcan did not move. He had learned a long time ago that stillness was a language, that the man who moved first revealed the most. That patience, especially in moments of chaos, was the only currency that never inflated. So he stood beside his car and watched. The bride, whoever she was, had stopped at the edge of the courtyard, where the cathedral grounds met the public square. She was breathing hard, her shoulders rising and falling beneath the torn lace of her gown. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever elaborate arrangement it had been pinned into, and it fell around her face in tangled waves. She looked left. She looked right. She looked like a woman who had just realized that escaping was only the first problem. The second problem was where to go when you had just set fire to your entire life and everyone in it. Behind her, the cathedral doors burst open. 3 men in suits emerged first, then a fourth. Then a man in a gray tuxedo with silver cufflinks and a face that was already red with rage. The groom. Lorcan recognized the type immediately. The posture. The entitlement. The way his anger preceded him like a weather system. Men like this didn't get angry because something had been taken from them. They got angry because something they believed they owned had dared to act like it had a choice. "Marin!" The groom's voice cracked across the courtyard like a whip. The bride, Marin, flinched, but she did not turn around. That was the detail Lorcan noticed most. She flinched because her body had been trained to respond to that voice. But she did not turn because something inside her had already made a decision that her body hadn't caught up to yet. "Marin, get back here, now." She started walking, not toward the groom, toward the square, toward the street. Toward Lorcan, though she didn't know it yet, didn't see him standing in the shadow of the old elm tree beside his car. She was simply walking in the only direction that wasn't backward, and Lorcan Vane made a decision of his own. He stepped out of the shadows and into her path. The evening had that particular quality of October light that made everything look like a faded photograph. The sky was the color of bruised plums, and the street lamps were just beginning to flicker on, casting pools of amber onto cobblestones that had been worn smooth by 3 centuries of footsteps. Street. Aldrich's Cathedral rose behind the courtyard like a monument to obligations. Its Gothic spires clawed at the sky, and its stained glass windows lit from within by the ceremony that was now collapsing into chaos, threw shards of colored light onto the flagstones. Red, blue, gold. The colors of heaven, bleeding onto the ground. The garden between the cathedral and the square had been decorated for the occasion. White ribbons hung from wrought iron lampposts. Rose petals had been scattered along the stone path. Someone had placed candles in glass holders along the low wall that separated the sacred ground from the secular street. But the wind had picked up. The ribbons twisted and snapped. The rose petals skittered across the stones like small fleeing things. The candle flames bent sideways, guttering, struggling to stay lit against a world that was suddenly moving too fast. It was the kind of evening that felt like an ending, the kind that smelled of dead leaves and cold rain coming, the kind where the space between what was and what would be narrowed to a single breath. Marin Lacey had dreamed of her wedding day since she was 9 years old. She had imagined the dress, the flowers, the music, and the faces of people who loved her watching as she walked toward a future she had chosen. But there had been no choice here. There had only been her father's voice 3 months ago saying, "The Thornberry family has made a generous offer." There had only been her mother's silence, which was its own kind of agreement. There had only been Drystan Cole, her intended, smiling at her across a dinner table with eyes that calculated her value the way a butcher calculates the value of meat. And there had been the contract. She had seen it. She had seen her name on it, and a number beside her name, and her father's signature at the bottom, and she had understood in that moment that she was not a daughter. She was an asset. She was a transaction. She was already sold. The courtyard stretched ahead of her, the square beyond it, the world beyond that. And all of it was terrifying, because she had no money, no phone, no allies, and a groom who would not let her go. But behind her was worse. Behind her was a lifetime of being owned. So she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, her torn dress dragging on the stones, her bleeding hand pressed against her stomach, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. And she almost collided with the man who stepped into her path. Marin stopped. The man in front of her was tall, over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled his dark coat like they had been measured for it. His hair was black, cut short, and there was a thin scar along his jawline that caught the lamplight. His eyes were the color of winter storms, gray with something darker underneath, and they were looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not pity, not curiosity, something closer to recognition. "Move," she said. Her voice was raw. Her throat hurt from the scream she had released inside the cathedral when Drystan had grabbed her wrist and squeezed until she felt the bones shift. "Please, I need to go." The man didn't move. Go where? The question stopped her, because she didn't have an answer. She had nothing. She had walked out of her life with a torn dress, $37 sewn into her hem, and blood on her knuckles from the moment she had finally, after 26 years of compliance, hit back. "Anywhere," she whispered. "Anywhere but here." Behind her, the footsteps were getting closer. "Marin!" Drystan's voice was louder now, angrier. She could hear the other men with him, their shoes on the cobblestones, their voices low and coordinated. They were spreading out, flanking, cutting off her exits, because Drystan Cole didn't lose things that belonged to him. And according to the contract her father had signed, she belonged to him now. "Is that your husband?" the stranger asked. "He was supposed to be." Marin glanced over her shoulder. Drystan was 40 feet away and closing. In about 6 minutes. "What happened?" "I said no." The stranger's expression changed, barely a movement, but something behind his eyes became less cold. And the blood on your hand? He didn't like hearing no. Maren heard Dristan's men circling to her left. She had maybe 30 seconds before they reached her. Maybe less. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the place where Dristan had grabbed her and left bruises that were only now beginning to bloom purple beneath her skin. I don't know who you are, she said to the stranger. I don't know if you're better or worse than him, but I know what's behind me, and I would rather take my chances with a stranger than go back to that cathedral. She tried to step around him. He didn't block her. Instead, he did something she didn't expect. He took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm. It smelled like cedar and something darker. Something that spoke of rooms where important men made important decisions. The weight of it settled onto her like armor. My car is behind me, he said. The black one. Get in. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. Why would you? Because I know what he is. The stranger's voice was calm, but there was iron underneath it. I've always known what men like him are. And I've spent my entire life becoming the kind of man they're afraid of. Maren stared at him. The footsteps were closer now. 20 feet. 15. Go, he said. She went. The inside of the car was leather and silence. Maren locked the doors with shaking hands and pressed her back against the seat and watched through the tinted window as the stranger turned to face Dristan Cole. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see it. She could see the way Dristan's confidence flickered when he recognized who he was talking to. She could see the way his men stopped moving, frozen at the edges of the courtyard like dogs who had suddenly caught a scent they knew better than to chase. She could see the stranger say something quiet, something short, and she could see Dristan's face drain of color. Then the stranger turned his back on all of them and walked toward the car. He didn't hurry. He didn't look over his shoulder. He walked like a man who had never once in his life been afraid of what was behind him. When he opened the driver's door and slid into the seat beside her, Maren realized she was holding her breath. What did you say to him? The truth. He started the engine. That you're under my protection now, and that the consequences of ignoring that would be extensive. The car pulled away from the curb. Maren watched the cathedral shrink in the side mirror. She watched Dristan standing in the courtyard, his gray tuxedo perfect, his silver cufflinks catching the lamplight, his face twisted into an expression she had never seen before. Fear. For the first time since she had met him, Dristan Cole was afraid. Who are you? She asked. Lorcan Vane. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it suggested that it meant something to most people, something significant. Why are you helping me? Because nobody helped her. The answer made no sense. But before Maren could ask what it meant, the car turned a corner and the cathedral disappeared entirely, and she felt something crack open in her chest. Not relief. Not yet. Something older than relief. Something that felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. She had been holding herself together for 3 months, 91 days since her father had told her about the arrangement. 91 days of smiling at dinners she didn't want to attend, trying on dresses she didn't want to wear, practicing vows she didn't want to say. 91 days of telling herself that maybe it would be fine. Maybe Dristan would be kind. Maybe the contract was just business, just paperwork, just the way things were done in families like hers. But she had known. She had known from the first dinner, when Dristan had corrected the way she held her fork. She had known from the second dinner when he had told her which of her friends she would no longer be seeing. She had known from the night he had shown her the house where they would live and walked her through every room and told her exactly where she would be allowed to go and when. You have such potential, he had said, running his finger along her jawline. You just need guidance. She had smiled. She had said thank you. She had gone home that night and locked herself in the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. And still, she had told herself to endure, to survive, to become whatever small, quiet thing would keep the peace, because that was what women in her family did. That was what her mother had done. That was the inheritance passed down through generations of silence. But then came tonight. Tonight, standing in the bridal suite, her mother had zipped up her dress and whispered, "You'll learn to love him. I learned to love your father." And Marin had looked in the mirror and seen a ghost. A woman in white who was already disappearing. That was the moment she knew. If she walked down that aisle, the woman she was would die there. And whatever came back would belong to Drystan Cole, would be shaped by his hands, would smile his approved smile, and speak his approved words, and slowly, inevitably, forget that she had ever been anyone else. So when the music started and the doors opened and she saw him standing at the altar with that proprietary smile, she had turned around. And when Drystan had grabbed her wrist in the vestibule and said, "You're embarrassing me," she had broken his nose. Lorcan drove in silence for 12 blocks. He took a route that wound through the old industrial district, past warehouses that had been converted to lofts, and foundries that had been converted to nothing. Just dark buildings with broken windows and histories no one remembered. He was thinking about his mother. Her name had been Brianna Vane, and she had been 17 years old when her father promised her to Cormac Vane in exchange for the forgiveness of a gambling debt. She had worn a white dress she didn't choose. She had walked into a church she didn't want to enter. She had said vows she didn't mean to a man who saw her as payment, not a person. Lorcan had been born 11 months later, and for the next 14 years, he had watched his mother become a ghost in her own home. She had cooked meals she wasn't allowed to eat until Cormac was finished. She had worn clothes Cormac selected. She had smiled when Cormac told her to smile, and cried only in the bathroom with the water running so no one would hear. She had never once complained. She had never once fought back. She had simply diminished, year by year, until one morning when Lorcan was 14, she didn't wake up. The coroner had called it heart failure, but Lorcan knew the truth. Some hearts don't fail. They surrender. They reach a point where continuing to beat inside a life that was never theirs becomes too heavy, too pointless, too much. His mother had died of being owned, and Lorcan had sworn, standing beside her grave in a cemetery where no one else came, that he would become the kind of man who could never be owned by anyone. He would become so powerful that no one would ever tell him where to stand, what to wear, when to speak. He had kept that promise. He had built an empire out of that promise. But he had also built a wall around the part of him that remembered being a boy who couldn't protect his mother. A wall around the part of him that still heard her crying through the bathroom door. A wall around the part of him that had never forgiven himself for being too small, too young, too weak to save her. And now, sitting in the car beside him, was a woman in a torn wedding dress who had done what his mother never could. She had fought back. She had broken her captor's nose. She had walked out of that cathedral with blood on her knuckles and fury in her eyes, and not a single person in the world willing to help her. Until now. Lorcan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders still trembling beneath his coat. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he had done, who he had become, how many men had learned to fear the sound of his name. She only knew that she had nowhere else to go, and that was enough. That was more than his mother had ever had. "Where are we going?" Marin asked quietly. "Somewhere safe." Is there such a place? Lorcan thought about the question. He thought about his mother, who had never found such a place. He thought about the empire he had built, the walls he had constructed, the power he had accumulated for exactly this reason, for exactly this moment, for the day when someone who needed protection would cross his path, and he would finally be able to do what he couldn't do when he was 14 years old. Yes, he said. There is now. The building Lorcan brought her to was not what Marin expected. She had imagined something cold, industrial, the kind of place where men who made other men afraid conducted their business in shadows and silence. Instead, the car pulled into an underground garage beneath a residential tower in the Ashford district, one of the oldest and most elegant neighborhoods in the city. The elevator required a key card and a 6-digit code. It rose 18 floors without stopping. When the doors opened, Marin stepped into a foyer with marble floors and soft lighting and a view of the city that stretched to the river. "This is yours?" she asked. "One of several places." Lorcan removed his key card and set it on a table by the door. "But this is the most secure. No one knows about it except 2 people. Now 3. Marin walked slowly into the living room. Everything was tasteful, understated, and expensive in the way that didn't need to announce itself. Leather furniture in deep browns. Bookshelves lined with volumes that looked red, not decorative. A fireplace with a marble mantel, and above it, a single painting of a woman standing at a window, her back to the viewer, her hand pressed against the glass. She stopped in front of the painting. "Who is she?" Lorcan was quiet for a moment. "My mother." Marin looked at the painting again. The woman's posture was elegant but somehow also sad. There was something in the angle of her shoulders, the way her fingers spread against the glass that spoke of longing, of looking out at a world she couldn't reach. "She's beautiful." She was. The past tense hung in the air. Marin turned to face him. In the soft light of the apartment, Lorcan Vane looked different than he had in the courtyard. Still dangerous, still controlled. But there was something else now. Something underneath the armor. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I don't know you. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know if I've traded one cage for another." She paused. "But I'd rather know now than find out later." Lorcan didn't flinch from the question. "I want nothing from you. Everyone wants something." "Then let me be specific." He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the city lights. "I want you to be safe. I want you to have time to figure out what comes next. I want you to walk out that door whenever you choose, with nothing owed and nothing expected." He turned. "I want to do for you what no one did for her." He glanced at the painting. Marin felt something loosen in her chest. Not trust, not yet. Trust was a language she had forgotten how to speak. But something adjacent to trust. Something that felt like the first unknotting of a rope that had been pulled tight for months. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" "You don't." Lorcan's voice was steady. "You can only watch, and decide for yourself whether my actions match my words." He gestured toward a hallway. "There's a guest room, private bathroom, lock on the door, clothes in the closet that should fit, nothing special, just things I keep for situations that require discretion." He paused. "You can stay as long as you need. You can leave whenever you want. The elevator code is 771409, my mother's birthday." Marin stared at him. No conditions, no expectations, no invisible strings waiting to tighten around her throat. Just an open door, a lock that worked from the inside, and a man who had given her his mother's birthday as proof that he meant what he said. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Lorcan looked at her for a long moment. "Because I was 14 when she died," he said quietly. "And I've spent every day since becoming strong enough to make sure it never happens again. Not to anyone. Not if I can stop it." He walked toward his own room at the far end of the hall. "Good night, Marin." The door closed behind him, and Marin Lacey stood alone in the living room of a penthouse that belonged to a man she didn't know, wearing his coat over her ruined wedding dress, and cried for the first time since the nightmare began. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, the afternoon sun was slanting through curtains she didn't remember closing, and for one disoriented moment, She didn't know where she was. Then it came back. The cathedral. The courtyard. The man with storm-colored eyes who had stepped into her path and changed everything. Marin sat up slowly. The guest room was simple but comfortable. A queen bed with white linens. A dresser with a mirror. A window that looked out onto a small balcony where pigeons were strutting along the railing. On the chair beside the bed, someone had laid out clothes. Dark jeans, a soft gray sweater. Undergarments still in their packaging, the tags removed. Simple black flats in her size. She didn't know how he had known her size. She decided not to ask. The bathroom had a shower with water pressure that felt like mercy. She stood under it for 20 minutes, watching the remnants of yesterday swirl down the drain. Mascara, hairspray. The last traces of the woman who had walked into St. Aldrich's Cathedral expecting to lose herself. When she emerged, dressed in clothes that fit and hair still damp, she found Lorcan in the kitchen. He was cooking. The image was so incongruous that she stopped in the doorway and stared. "You cook?" "I eat." He didn't look up from the pan where eggs were sizzling. "Cooking is a prerequisite. I just didn't expect a man like me to know how to make an omelet?" "Something like that." Lorcan glanced at her. There was something almost like amusement in his expression. "Almost?" "Sit down, you need to eat." She sat. He placed a plate in front of her. Omelet with herbs and cheese, toast with butter, a glass of orange juice, coffee in a cup that was heavy and warm in her hands. "This is the first real meal I've had in 3 months," she said quietly. Lorcan sat across from her with his own plate. "Why 3 months?" "Because Drystand controlled what I ate." She took a bite of the omelet. It was perfect. "He said I needed to be a certain size for the wedding dress. He had a nutritionist send over meal plans. 700 calories a day. My mother watched to make sure I followed them." Lorcan's jaw tightened. "Your mother helped him?" "My mother helped my father sell me." Marin's voice was flat. "She's been helping men control women her entire life. It's the only skill she knows." She ate in silence for a few minutes. The food was warm in her stomach, solid, real. She had forgotten what it felt like to eat without counting, without measuring, without hearing Drystan's voice in her head calculating whether she deserved each bite. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on what you want." "I don't know what I want. I've never been allowed to want anything." Lorcan set down his fork. "Then let's start smaller. What do you want right now?" "This moment. Nothing else." Marin thought about it. "I want to finish this omelet. I want to drink this coffee. I want to sit here without anyone telling me what to do or who to be." She paused. "And I want to know what Drystan is going to do next, because he won't let this go. Men like him never do." "No," Lorcan agreed. "They don't." "You know what kind of man he is?" "I know exactly what kind of man he is." Lorcan's voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Something cold and patient and very, very dangerous. Drysdan Cole is Edmund Thornberry's nephew, groomed since childhood to inherit the family's interests. The Thornberrys have operated in this city for 40 years. They trade in influence, intimidation, and the buying of things that shouldn't be for sale. He paused. "Including people. The marriage wasn't just debt repayment. It was a merger. You know them?" "I know everyone." "Then you know he'll come for me." "Yes." "And?" Lorcan looked at her across the table. His eyes held hers without wavering. "And he'll learn what happens when he tries." Over the next 3 days, Marin told Lorcan everything. She told him about her father, Goddard Lacey, who had built a real estate empire on borrowed money and broken promises. She told him about the debt, $3 million owed to the Thornberry family for investments that had gone wrong, for properties that had collapsed, for decisions made in desperation and regretted in silence. She told him about the dinner where Drystan had first looked at her, how his eyes had moved over her body like he was appraising livestock, how her father had smiled and poured more wine and pretended not to notice. She told him about the proposal, if you could call it that. Drystan hadn't asked. He had informed. "We'll be married in October. Your father and I have already discussed the details." Like she was a line item in a contract. Like her consent was a formality that had already been handled. She told him about the months that followed. The dress fittings where Drystan's mother had criticized her posture, her hair, her smile. The dinners where Drystan had corrected her opinions until she stopped having them. The night he had grabbed her face and said, "You're going to be perfect for me. I'll make sure of it." And she told him about the contract. "I found it in my father's office," she said. They were sitting on the balcony now, watching the sun set over the city. 3 weeks before the wedding. I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs, and his office door was open, and it was just sitting there on his desk. What did it say? It said that in exchange for the forgiveness of all debts, Goddard Lacey agreed to transfer guardianship of his daughter, Marin Lacey, age 26, to Drystan Cole, to be formalized through marriage. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. It listed me like property. It had a value next to my name, $3.2 million. That's what I was worth to them. Lorcan was silent for a long moment. "Did you confront your father?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Marin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He said I should be grateful. He said Drystan was a good match. He said most daughters would be thrilled to marry into that kind of wealth." She paused. "And when I told him I wouldn't do it, he said I didn't have a choice. He said the contract was already signed. He said if I ran, the Thornberrys would find me, and what happened next would be my fault." "So you stayed?" "I stayed for 3 more weeks." I smiled. I attended the rehearsal dinner. I let them put me in that dress and paint my face and march me toward that altar. Her voice cracked. "Because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have money. I didn't have friends. Everyone I had ever trusted had either sold me or helped sell me. I was completely alone." "What changed?" Marin looked at him. "I saw my reflection, standing in the bridal suite, in that dress, with that veil. And I didn't recognize myself. I looked like a corpse, like something that was already dead and just hadn't stopped moving yet." She took a breath. "And I decided that if I was going to die, I'd rather die running than die walking down that aisle." Lorcan reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since placing his coat over her shoulders in the courtyard. His hand was warm, steady. It held hers without squeezing, without demanding, without any of the possessiveness she had learned to expect from men. "You're not going to die," he said quietly. "Not running. Not any other way. Not if I have anything to say about it." "Why do you care so much?" "Because someone should have cared about her." He didn't say his mother's name. He didn't have to. Marin understood. "There's something else," she said. "Something I haven't told you." "Tell me." "Drystan's family, the Thornberrys, they're not just wealthy. They're connected. Politicians, judges, police commissioners. Half the city owes them favors." She paused. "If Drystan decides to come for me, he won't come alone. He'll come with lawyers who can make me look like a criminal. He'll come with police officers who'll arrest me for assault. He'll come with judges who'll rule in his favor before I even open my mouth." "I know." "And you still want to help me?" A crack appeared in the armor Lorcan wore. "The Thornberrys have operated in this city for 40 years, he said. "I've operated in this city for 23. They have politicians and judges and police commissioners." He paused. "I have the men who make politicians and judges and police commissioners disappear." Marin stared at him. "What exactly do you do?" "I solve problems." His voice was calm. Problems that can't be solved any other way. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. He squeezed her hand gently. The Thornberrys think they're powerful because they buy people, but bought loyalty only lasts until someone offers a higher price. He paused. The men who work for me aren't bought. They're bound. And that's a different thing entirely. Bound by what? By the knowledge that I would die for any one of them. And they would do the same for me. Marin looked at this man, this stranger who had stepped into her path and offered her everything without asking for anything in return. Drystan will destroy you if he can, she said. You know that, right? He'll come after you with everything he has. Lorcan smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It was not a warm smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of fight. Let him come, Lorcan said. I've been waiting for someone like him my whole life. The next morning, Lorcan made a phone call. Marin sat in the living room drinking coffee, watching him pace by the window with his phone pressed to his ear. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the way his posture changed as he spoke, the way his shoulders squared, the way his voice dropped into a register that made the air feel heavier. When he hung up, he turned to her. I've arranged a meeting with someone who can help. Who? Her name is Cordelia Vance. She's an attorney, the best in the city, possibly the best in the state. He paused. She specializes in cases like yours. Coerced marriages, financial exploitation, domestic control. She has a success rate of 94%, and the 6% she loses usually involve clients who don't follow her instructions. How do you know her? She was my mother's cousin. Lorcan's voice softened almost imperceptibly. She tried to help back then. My father wouldn't allow it. But after he died, Cordelia and I reconnected. She's been waiting 30 years for me to bring her a case like this. A case like what? A woman who fought back. A woman who has evidence. A woman who's willing to stand up in a courtroom and say what was done to her. He walked toward her. You have the contract. Marin. You have proof that your father sold you? That's not just leverage. That's a weapon. The contract is in my father's office. It was. Now it's in my safe. Marin stared at him. How? I have people who are very good at retrieving things. Lorcan sat down across from her. The contract was collected last night, along with several other documents that your father would prefer remained private. Financial records, communications with the Thornberry family, evidence of other transactions he's been involved in over the years. Other transactions? Your father didn't just sell you, Marin. You weren't his first. Lorcan's voice was quiet. He's been brokering arrangements like this for decades. Daughters of business partners, nieces of associates, women who had no one to protect them and no way to fight back. Marin felt sick. How many? At least 7 that we've found so far. Possibly more. She put her coffee down because her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. My father is a trafficker. Your father is a man who saw women as currency. Lorcan's jaw tightened, and he's about to discover what happens when the currency fights back. There was a knock at the door. Lorcan rose and crossed the room. When he opened it, a woman stepped inside. She was perhaps 55, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that assessed Marin in a single glance. So, Cordelia Vance said, you're the one who broke Drystan Cole's nose. Yes. Good. Cordelia set down her briefcase and smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had spent her entire career waiting to destroy men like Drystan Cole. Let's talk about how we're going to destroy his entire family. Over the next 2 hours, Cordelia laid out the strategy. First, they would file for an emergency protective order. The evidence of coercion, the contract, the financial records, the testimony Marin could provide would be enough to establish immediate legal protection. Second, They would file a civil suit against Goddard Lacey for human trafficking and fraud. The other women Lorcan's people had identified would be contacted and offered the opportunity to join the case. Third, they would report Drystan Cole to the police for assault. Marin's bruised wrist had been photographed that first night. The broken nose had been witnessed by 400 wedding guests. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. What about his connections? Marin asked. The judges? The politicians? The police? Cordelia smiled again. The Thornberrys have connections, she acknowledged, but connections are like chains. They can bind you to power, or they can drag you down when the power shifts. She glanced at Lorcan. And power in this city is about to shift considerably. Marin looked at Lorcan. What does that mean? It means, Lorcan said quietly, that I've spent 23 years building relationships of my own. Not with politicians who can be bought or judges who can be pressured. With people who owe me debts that can't be measured in money. He paused. The Thornberrys are about to discover that the city they thought they owned has been rented from me the entire time. Cordelia gathered her papers. I'll have the protective order filed by tomorrow morning. The civil suit will follow within the week. In the meantime, stay here. Stay safe. Don't contact your family. She paused at the door. And Marin? For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Running. Fighting. All of it. There's not one woman in 100 who would have had the courage to do what you did. When the door closed behind her, Marin sat in the silence of the penthouse and tried to process everything that had just happened. In less than 72 hours, she had gone from a bride about to be sold to a woman with a legal team, a protector, and a chance. It's really happening, she whispered. Isn't it? Lorcan sat down beside her. Close enough to touch. Not touching. It's really happening. What if it doesn't work? What if they're too powerful? They're not. How can you be sure? Lorcan looked at her with those eyes that had seen too much and survived it all. Because power isn't about money or connections or influence, he said. Power is about will. It's about how far you're willing to go. How much you're willing to sacrifice. He paused. The Thornberrys are willing to go far to protect their reputation. But I'm willing to go further to protect you, and that's the difference that matters. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Why would you sacrifice anything for me? You don't even know me. Lorcan was quiet for a long moment. I know that you were alone, he said finally. I know that everyone who should have protected you chose their own interests instead. I know that you fought back when fighting back might have gotten you killed. He paused. And I know that my mother never had anyone who would have done for her what I'm doing for you. That knowledge has been a weight I've carried every day since I was 14 years old. He turned to face her fully. You asked me why I'm doing this. The truth is, I'm not doing it just for you. I'm doing it for her. For every woman who was ever sold or controlled or diminished by men who thought ownership was the same as love. His voice dropped. And I'm doing it for myself. Because every time I protect someone like you, a part of me finally feels like I've earned the right to exist. Marin reached out and took his hand. You don't have to earn that, she said softly. You just have to be. The mask Lorcan had worn for decades slipped, just slightly, something that looked almost like hope. The protective order was granted in 18 hours. Cordelia called with the news while Marin was standing on the balcony, watching the morning light spread across the city. The judge had reviewed the evidence, the contract, the photographs, the preliminary statements, and had ruled immediately. Drystan Cole was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Marin Lacey. The Thornberry family's assets related to the marriage arrangement were frozen pending investigation, and Goddard Lacey had been served with papers informing him that he was the subject of a criminal referral to the district attorney's office. It's the first step, Cordelia said, but it's a significant one. The Thornberrys are already scrambling. Their lawyers have filed 3 motions to dismiss, and all 3 have been denied. What happens next? Next, we build the case. The other women Lorcan identified are being contacted. 4 have already agreed to testify. The financial records your father kept are damning. By the time this goes to trial, the Thornberry family won't just be facing civil liability, they'll be facing federal charges. When Marin hung up, she found Lorcan standing in the doorway. You heard? I heard. It's working. It's working. She walked toward him and stopped a foot away. Close enough to see the faint lines around his eyes. Close enough to smell the cedar and smoke scent that she had come to associate with safety. Thank you, she said. For all of it. For everything. You don't have to thank me. I want to. She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers traced the scar along his jaw. You gave me my life back. You gave me a chance to be something other than property. How do I repay something like that? Lorcan caught her hand gently. By living it, he said. By becoming whoever you were supposed to be before they tried to take it away. And if I don't know who that is, then you find out. Day by day. Choice by choice. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. You have time now. You have space. You have the freedom to discover what you want, instead of being told what you should want. What if what I want is standing right in front of me? The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Lorcan went still. Marin, I know it's too soon. I know I'm supposed to heal first, supposed to figure out who I am, supposed to take time. She didn't pull her hand away. But I've spent my entire life being told what I'm supposed to do, and right now, I want to do something because I choose it. You don't know what I am. I see who you are. She stepped closer. You're the man who stepped into my path when I had nowhere to go. You're the man who gave me his mother's birthday because you wanted me to feel safe. You're the man who looked at me like I was a person when everyone else looked at me like a transaction. She paused. I see who you are, Lorcan. The question is whether you see who I am. Who are you? I'm someone who refuses to be owned ever again. Her voice was steady. And if I choose to be with you, it won't be because you saved me. It will be because I want you. Because you see me. Because when I'm with you, I finally feel like I exist. Lorcan looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting his entire life for someone who would choose him, not because of his power, but in spite of it. When they broke apart, Marin was breathing hard. I should tell you something, Lorcan said quietly. I don't do things halfway. If you choose this, if you choose me, I will protect you with everything I have. I will fight for you. I will build a world around you where nothing can ever hurt you again. He paused. But I will also love you with an intensity that frightens most people. I will want all of you, not just the parts that are easy. And if I want that, then you should know what you're agreeing to. Marin smiled. It was the first real smile she had given anyone in months. I'm agreeing to be wanted, she said. To be chosen. To be loved by someone who sees me as a person, not a possession. She reached up and touched his face again. I spent my whole life being afraid of intensity, being told to be smaller, quieter, less. You're offering me the opposite. You're offering me more. Is that what you want? It's what I've always wanted. She kissed him again, softer this time. I just didn't know it existed until I met you. Over the following weeks, the case against the Thornberry family unraveled their empire, piece by piece. 6 women came forward, then 8, then 11. The financial records Lorcan's people had collected painted a picture of systematic exploitation spanning 2 decades. Goddard Lacey was arrested on a Tuesday morning while eating breakfast at his club. The photograph of him being led out in handcuffs made the front page of every newspaper in the city. Drystan Cole attempted to flee the country. He made it as far as the airport before he discovered that his passport had been flagged, his accounts had been frozen, and two of Lorcan's men were waiting in the parking garage to explain, in terms Drystan finally understood, that running was not an option. The trial began in January. Marin testified for 4 hours. She spoke clearly, steadily, without tears, about the contract, the coercion, the violence, the moment she had looked in the mirror and decided she would rather die than disappear. When she stepped down from the witness stand, Lorcan was waiting in the hallway. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her into his arms and held her while the weight of everything she had carried for so long finally, fully, lifted. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "The trial isn't over yet." "I know. But the part where I was afraid? The part where I didn't know if I would survive?" She looked up at him. "That part is over. Because of you." "Because of you," he corrected. "I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it." The verdict came 3 weeks later. Guilty on all counts. Goddard Lacey was sentenced to 23 years. Drystan Cole received 18. The Thornberry family's assets were seized, their businesses dismantled, their name reduced from a symbol of power to a warning about what happens when you treat people like property. And Marin Lacey stood in the courtroom, hand in hand with the man who had saved her life, and watched the empire that had tried to own her crumble into dust. 3 months after the verdict, Marin stood on the balcony of a rented villa on the Mediterranean coast, their honeymoon retreat, and tried to remember the woman she had been. The woman in the torn wedding dress, the woman with blood on her knuckles and nowhere to go. The woman who had stood in a courtyard in October and whispered 3 words into the cold air. She couldn't find her. Not because that woman had disappeared, but because that woman had transformed. Had become someone stronger. Someone who knew her own worth. Someone who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. "You're thinking again." Lorcan's voice came from behind her. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "I'm always thinking." "About what?" "About how different everything is. About how a year ago, I was counting the days until my life ended. And now—" She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "Now I don't recognize my own story. Is that good?" "It's terrifying." She smiled. "And wonderful. And completely, utterly new." They had been married 6 weeks ago. Not in a cathedral. Not with 400 guests. Not with a dress chosen by someone else and vows written by tradition. They had been married on a beach at sunset, barefoot in the sand, with Cordelia as their witness and the ocean as their audience. Marin had worn a simple white dress she had chosen herself. Lorcan had worn a suit without a tie. They had written their own vows and meant every word. "I spent my whole life building walls," Lorcan had said, holding her hands in his. "You're the first person who made me want to tear them down." "I spent my whole life being told who to be," Marin had replied. "You're the first person who wanted to know who I actually am." That night, they had danced in the moonlight while the waves crashed against the shore. And Marin had understood finally what it meant to be chosen. Now she stood on the balcony of their honeymoon villa, watching the sun set over the water, and felt Lorcan's hands spread across her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Tell me." She had found out 3 days ago. She had been waiting for the right moment. But watching the sunset, feeling his arms around her, she realized there was no perfect moment. There was only this one. "I'm pregnant." Lorcan went still. His hands didn't move from her stomach. His breath didn't change, but she could feel something shift in him. Something that had been waiting, hoping, finally receiving. "Say that again." "I'm pregnant." She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. We're going to have a baby. Lorcan looked at her, and in all the weeks she had known him, she had never seen him cry. Until now. Not sobbing, not breaking down, just tears, silent and silver, sliding down the face of a man who had spent his entire life protecting everyone except himself. A baby, he whispered. A baby. Our baby. Ours. She took his face in her hands. A child who will never know what it means to be sold, who will never know what it means to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them. A child who will grow up knowing they are loved, wanted, chosen. Lorcan pressed his forehead against hers. I never thought I would have this, he said quietly. I never thought I deserved it. You deserve everything, she said. You gave me my life back. You gave me freedom. You gave me a future I never thought was possible. She kissed him softly. And now I'm giving you a family. They stood there as the sun sank below the horizon and the sky turned from gold to purple to the deep blue of approaching night. And Lorcan Vane, the man who had built an empire on fear, held the woman he loved and wept for the mother he had lost and the child he would raise differently. 6 months later, their daughter was born. They named her Brianna, after the grandmother she would never meet. She had Lorcan's gray eyes and Marin's dark hair, and when she cried, her father held her against his chest and whispered stories about a woman who had never been given a choice, who had died before her time, who would have loved this child more than anything in the world. I'll tell you about her, he promised his daughter. I'll tell you everything. So she's never forgotten. So you know where you come from. So you understand why your mother and I will never, ever let anyone take your choices away. Marin watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes, and understood that this was the moment everything had been leading toward. Not the trial, not the verdict, not even the wedding. This. A man holding his daughter. A woman watching from a doorway. A family built not on contracts or transactions, but on love. They moved into an estate outside the city, 40 acres of land with gardens and orchards, and a view of the mountains that seemed to go on forever. There was a room for Brianna with windows that let in the morning light. There was a library where Marin spent her afternoons reading books she chose herself. There was an office where Lorcan still conducted his business, but increasingly from a distance, increasingly through trusted lieutenants, because he had discovered that building an empire meant nothing if you weren't home to watch your daughter take her first steps. Marin started a foundation in her mother-in-law's name, the Brianna Vane Foundation, dedicated to helping women escape coercive relationships. Within a year, they had funded shelters in 8 cities, legal assistance for over 200 women, and a public awareness campaign that had changed the way the media talked about domestic coercion. You turned your pain into purpose, Cordelia told her at the Foundation's first anniversary gala. That's the only way to survive what you survived, by making sure it never happens to anyone else. Lorcan taught me that, Marin said. No. Cordelia smiled. You taught him that. He was surviving before he met you. You're the one who showed him how to live. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she ran from her wedding, Marin returned to St. Aldrich's Cathedral. Not to go inside. Just to stand in the courtyard where everything had changed. The cobblestones were the same. The iron gates. The elm tree where Lorcan had been standing when she first saw him. The bench where tourists now sat taking photographs of the Gothic spires. Lorcan stood beside her, Brianna in his arms. Why here? He asked. Because I needed to remember. Marin looked at the spot where she had stumbled through the gates, dress torn and blood on her knuckles, 3 words on her lips. I needed to see it again, to understand how far we've come. And I don't recognize it. She turned to him, to their daughter, to the life she had built from the ashes of the life that had been stolen from her. It feels like another world, like something that happened to someone else. It did happen to someone else. Lorcan shifted Brianna in his arms and reached out to take Marin's hand. The woman who ran from this cathedral doesn't exist anymore. She became someone new, someone stronger, someone who chose her own life instead of accepting the one she was given. Someone who found you. Someone I found. He squeezed her hand. Someone I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for. Brianna gurgled and reached for her mother. Marin took her daughter from Lorcan's arms and held her close, breathing in the scent of baby powder and warmth and possibility. "You know what I thought that night?" she said, "standing right here, in this exact spot?" "What?" "I thought I was going to die. I thought Drysdown would catch me, and that would be the end. I thought the best I could hope for was a few hours of freedom before everything collapsed." She looked at Lorcan. "I never imagined this. A husband who loves me, a daughter who will grow up free, a life where I get to decide who I am and what I want." "And who are you?" Marin smiled. "I'm Marin Vane. I'm a mother. I'm a wife. I'm the founder of a foundation that helps women escape the life I almost didn't survive." She paused. "And I'm someone who learned that running from your wedding can be the first step toward finding everything you were always supposed to have." Lorcan leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You're also a queen," he said softly. "The only one I'll ever bow to." They walked out of the courtyard together, hand in hand, their daughter between them. The October sun was warm on their faces. The bell in the cathedral tower began to ring, marking the hour, marking the passage of time, marking the distance between who they had been and who they had become. And somewhere in the city, in an apartment Marin would never see again, a contract with her name on it had been reduced to ash. Burned by Lorcan on their wedding night. Because some things shouldn't be preserved. Some things should only be destroyed, so that something new, something better, something chosen can rise from what remains. Marin Vane walked into the autumn light with her husband and her daughter. She did not look back, because the woman who looked back was gone, and the woman who remained had no use for rearview mirrors, only open roads, only forward, only the life she had chosen and the family she had made, and the future that belonged to no one but her.